The courtroom was alive with an electric tension. Lawyers shuffled their papers, their voices cutting through the air like blades. A sea of faces watched from the gallery, some curious, others skeptical. At the heart of it all sat Judge Edward Harris, a man whose very presence commanded respect. Clad in a black robe that symbolized impartiality, he was the epitome of authority. Decades of experience had molded him into a figure both revered and feared. Yet today, his gaze held a flicker of something unusual, a mix of confidence and something else, though he would never admit it, doubt. On the opposite side of the room stood Alexandria Monroe. She was calm, composed, and radiating an energy that was impossible to ignore. Her dark skin glistened under the harsh fluorescent lights, her tailored navy suit a testament to her precision and focus. There was no badge of honor pinned to her chest, no title to explain her poise, yet the air around her seemed to hum with purpose. This wasn't the first time Judge Harris had encountered someone like her, or so he thought. Women like Alexandria, in his mind, were bold but predictable. They had passion, but rarely the depth of knowledge or strategy to back it up. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Another case, another chance to maintain the order of his courtroom. The stakes, however, were far higher than either of them yet realized. This was no ordinary trial. The case at hand wasn't just about laws and regulations. It was a collision of systemic bias, personal resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of truth. As proceedings began, Harris allowed himself a quiet smirk. He'd seen Alexandria's type before, the way they spoke with fire and conviction, only to falter when the burden of proof became too great. But Alexandria wasn't here to falter. She began her opening statement. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but firm, "this case is not just about justice. It's about accountability, about holding power to the same standards it demands of everyone else." The words landed like a gavel striking the bench. For a moment, the room seemed to pause, as though the weight of her conviction had pulled everyone into a shared gravity. Judge Harris shifted slightly in his chair, masking the unease creeping into his mind. Who was this woman? And why did her words stir something deeper than he was willing to acknowledge? The courtroom had always been his domain, a realm where he decided fates, set precedents, and upheld what he believed to be justice. But today, the lines were beginning to blur. This was more than just a case. It was a reckoning, a challenge to unspoken hierarchies that had endured for generations. And as Alexandria's voice filled the room, one question loomed over the proceedings. When does power cease to be about titles and authority and become something far more profound? Judge Edward Harris tapped his pen against the bench, a habit he reserved for moments of slight irritation. Alexandria Monroe stood poised, waiting for his ruling on a procedural motion she had just made. The motion, to Harris, seemed unnecessary. Another attempt, he thought, to draw attention where it wasn't warranted. "Denied," he said briskly, barely glancing up from his notes. "Your Honor," Alexandria interjected, her tone calm but firm, "I would respectfully request the court's reasoning for the denial, as it pertains directly to the admissibility of key evidence." Her words were measured, devoid of hostility. She wasn't challenging him, not overtly, but the subtle insistence in her voice gnawed at him. Harris sighed. "Ms. Monroe, the court finds your motion redundant. Let's proceed." Alexandria nodded, her expression unchanging, but her response was sharp. "Noted for the record, Your Honor." There it was again, that unrelenting precision. Harris felt a flicker of annoyance. Most attorneys would have accepted the denial and moved on. But Alexandria wasn't like most attorneys. She had a way of framing her arguments so meticulously that even her smallest objections seemed significant. As the proceedings continued, it became clear that Harris wasn't merely grappling with Alexandria's legal acumen. There was something deeper at play, something he hadn't confronted before. He prided himself on being impartial, on upholding the law without bias. But as he listened to Alexandria dismantle the opposing counsel's arguments with an elegance that bordered on surgical, he couldn't ignore the nagging thought. Was he underestimating her because of who she was? The courtroom dynamics reflected a larger reality. Alexandria's presence alone was a quiet act of defiance. She was a black woman standing in a space that had rarely welcomed people like her, much less acknowledged their authority. Every word she spoke, every precedent she cited, carried the weight of generations of struggle. Alexandria's client, a middle-aged black man named Harold Davis, had been unfairly terminated from his position at a prominent corporation. The case wasn't just about wrongful termination. It was a microcosm of systemic inequalities in the workplace. Harold's testimony painted a vivid picture of microaggressions and double standards, of being overlooked for promotions despite his qualifications, and of ultimately being pushed out under dubious circumstances. When Harold recounted the humiliation of being escorted out of the office in front of his colleagues, the room fell silent. His voice wavered, but his words were resolute. "I gave them 20 years of my life, and they treated me like I was disposable. Like I didn't matter." The gallery murmured, a ripple of shared indignation passing through the spectators. Harris shifted in his chair, uncomfortable not just with Harold's words, but with the undeniable truth they carried. Alexandria followed up with a line of questioning that left the opposing counsel scrambling. "Mr. Davis, can you clarify how often your ideas were implemented without acknowledgement? And how often were you told you were not a good fit for leadership roles despite your performance reviews?" Harris watched her, grudgingly impressed by how she navigated the testimony. She wasn't just building a case. She was painting a narrative that was impossible to ignore. Yet, he couldn't help but try. He found himself questioning her methods, looking for flaws, searching for reasons to undermine her credibility. Was it her tone? Her confidence? Or was it the way she refused to defer to him as so many others did? As the day progressed, Harris's internal conflict deepened. He dismissed another of Alexandria's motions, only to realize minutes later that her argument had been legally sound. He pretended not to notice her slight smile as she calmly corrected his oversight. "Your Honor," she said, her voice devoid of malice, "I believe the case law you cited applies only to criminal proceedings. In this civil matter, the precedent established in Franklin versus Carter is more relevant." Harris froze for a moment, his mind scrambling to recall the case. She was right. The gallery exchanged glances, sensing the subtle shift in power. Harris cleared his throat and issued a curt acknowledgement. The larger societal backdrop loomed over every exchange. This wasn't just a trial. It was a confrontation of entrenched biases that had long dictated who held power and whose voices were dismissed. Alexandria wasn't merely advocating for her client. She was challenging a system that had been designed to exclude people like them. As the afternoon session came to a close, Harris found himself reflecting on his interactions with Alexandria. He realized, with a pang of discomfort, that he had underestimated her, not because of her arguments, which were airtight, but because of his own assumptions. For her part, Alexandria never wavered. She knew the weight she carried into that courtroom. Every step she took, every word she spoke, was part of a broader fight for equity and respect. She wasn't here to dismantle the system outright. She was here to expose its cracks, to demand accountability, and to prove, unequivocally, that power wasn't about titles or robes. The tension between them was no longer subtle. It was a clash of worldviews, a battle between an old guard clinging to its authority and a new voice refusing to be silenced. Harris didn't realize it yet, but the ground beneath him was shifting, and Alexandria was at the center of it all. The courtroom was quieter now, with most of the gallery cleared for the afternoon recess. Judge Harris remained at his bench, reviewing the documents Alexandria had submitted earlier. They were meticulous, layered with arguments so tightly woven he could find no loose thread to pull. He was beginning to realize she wasn't just thorough, she was formidable. The turning point began innocuously enough. Alexandria introduced an affidavit from a former HR executive of the corporation Harold Davis had sued. It was a calculated move. The document contained damning testimony, outlining patterns of racial bias within the company's hiring and promotion practices. This affidavit outlines years of deliberate underrepresentation in leadership, Alexandria explained, her voice calm but resonant. The data provided corroborates my client's claims of systemic discrimination. Opposing counsel immediately objected. Your Honor, this testimony is irrelevant. The affiant is not directly tied to Mr. Davis's termination. Alexandria didn't flinch. Your Honor, the testimony establishes a pattern, one that provides essential context for the events leading to my client's termination. Ignoring this would be akin to isolating one wave from an entire ocean. Harris hesitated. He could see the weight of the argument, but he also saw the risk it posed to his carefully guarded neutrality. Allowing the testimony would broaden the case's implications, forcing a reckoning with uncomfortable truths. I'll allow it, he said finally, his voice tighter than usual. Alexandria nodded, as though she had anticipated his decision all along. Over the next few days, Alexandria's true power began to surface. She dismantled the opposing counsel's arguments with precision, not through aggression but through the quiet force of irrefutable evidence. In one instance, she used the company's own internal emails, which she had fought tooth and nail to have subpoenaed. Your Honor, she said, holding up a printed chain of emails, these messages between senior executives explicitly discuss strategies for diversifying appearances without actual structural change. She handed copies to the bench and opposing counsel. Harris scanned the emails, his frown deepening. The opposing attorney rose, flustered. These emails are out of context, Your Honor. They don't prove discriminatory intent. Alexandria didn't miss a beat. Out of context? Then let's add context. Your Honor, I've highlighted other communications from the same executives, discussing how certain employees, including my client, were too vocal about equity issues and deemed unsuitable for advancement. Harris looked up, meeting her gaze. He saw no triumph in her expression, only conviction. Late that evening, Harris sat in his chambers, staring at the stack of evidence Alexandria had submitted. He was beginning to realize she hadn't just come prepared. She had anticipated every move, every counterargument. He thought back to his initial impression of her, the assumptions he'd made without realizing. He prided himself on his objectivity, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd underestimated her. Not because of her arguments, which were airtight, but because of the biases he hadn't acknowledged within himself. For years, he had operated within a system that rarely challenged his authority. Now, Alexandria was forcing him to confront the blind spots he had long ignored. The next day, during cross-examination, Alexandria called the corporation's CEO to the stand. The room was packed, tension palpable. The CEO was a seasoned executive, polished and unflappable, or so it seemed. Alexandria's questions were surgical. Mr. Leonard, can you explain why, in your 20 years as CEO, there has never been a single black executive on your leadership team? Leonard shifted in his seat. We promote based on merit, Ms. Monroe. Race has never been a factor in our decisions. Never? Alexandria's voice was soft, but her words carried weight. Then how do you explain the internal report commissioned by your company last year, which found significant racial disparities in performance evaluations and promotions? Opposing counsel objected, but Harris overruled. Answer the question, Mr. Leonard. Leonard faltered. I can't speak to that specifically. Alexandria pressed on, her tone steady. You commissioned the report but took no action. My client's termination was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern of discrimination, one you allowed to persist. The CEO's silence spoke volumes. As the trial progressed, Harris began to see the case in a new light. It wasn't just about Harold Davis's termination. It was about a system that had failed countless others like him. And Alexandria wasn't just a skilled attorney. She was a force for accountability, a mirror reflecting the flaws of the very system he had sworn to uphold. During a recess, Harris found himself studying her from the bench. She was reviewing her notes, her expression calm but focused. He realized he had never seen her falter, not once. Every move she made was deliberate, every argument rooted in an unshakable moral compass. When the court reconvened, Alexandria delivered a closing argument that left the room in silence. She spoke not just of Harold Davis's experiences, but of the countless others whose stories went unheard. This case isn't just about one man's fight for justice, she said, her voice unwavering. It's about the systems we build and the values we claim to uphold. Justice is not a privilege, it's a right. And it's time we start treating it as such. Harris felt a lump in his throat, an unfamiliar weight pressing on him. For the first time in years, he felt his authority waver, not because it was being challenged, but because he was beginning to question the foundations on which it stood. The courtroom was packed for the final day of proceedings. A palpable tension filled the air. Every seat was taken, and the gallery buzzed with quiet anticipation. The case had become a lightning rod for discussions of equity and systemic bias, with local news outlets covering it as a potential landmark moment. Judge Harris took his seat, adjusting his robe. He scanned the courtroom, his gaze landing briefly on Alexandria. She stood beside Harold Davis, her presence commanding yet calm. She wasn't just an advocate for her client. She had become a symbol of unyielding justice. The pivotal moment came during Harold's testimony. Alexandria had prepared him well, guiding him through his responses with care. She asked simple, yet piercing questions that drew the jury into his lived experience. "Mr. Davis," she began, "how did it feel to watch less qualified colleagues receive promotions while you were consistently overlooked?" Harold's voice trembled but didn't break. "It felt like I was invisible. No matter how hard I worked, it was never enough. And when I spoke up, I became a problem they wanted to get rid of." Harris shifted in his seat, the weight of Harold's words pressing on him. The opposing counsel attempted to poke holes in Harold's story, but their efforts faltered against the mountain of evidence Alexandria had meticulously presented. The emails, the HR reports, the testimonies, all pointed to a systemic pattern of discrimination that couldn't be denied. And then Alexandria delivered her masterstroke. She introduced a timeline juxtaposing Harold's performance reviews with those of his white colleagues. The jury could see, in stark detail, how Harold's achievements had been downplayed while lesser accomplishments were rewarded elsewhere. "This isn't just bias," Alexandria stated firmly. "It's an institutional failure. And my client is here today because he refuses to let this failure define him or silence him." As the arguments closed, Harris found himself at a crossroads. For weeks, he had watched Alexandria dismantle the defenses of a system he had spent his career upholding. He had resisted her conclusions at first, unwilling to acknowledge the cracks in his worldview. But now, there was no denying it. Alexandria's competence, her unwavering commitment to justice, and her ability to expose the deeper truths of the case had left him humbled. She wasn't just fighting for her client. She was fighting for a principle that transcended the courtroom. He thought back to his early assumptions about her, the unconscious biases that had clouded his judgment. He had underestimated her not because of her arguments, but because of who she was, a black woman daring to challenge the structures that had long kept voices like hers on the margins. In that moment, Harris realized that true power didn't come from authority or tradition. It came from the courage to stand in the face of injustice, armed with truth and integrity. The jury returned its verdict. Harold Davis had been wrongfully terminated. The court awarded him significant damages, but the true victory was larger than the monetary settlement. The gallery erupted in muted applause, though Harris quickly called for order. He looked out at the courtroom, seeing a sea of faces, some jubilant, others reflective. The case had become a mirror, forcing everyone in the room to confront uncomfortable truths about bias and power. As the courtroom emptied, members of the press scrambled to get quotes from Alexandria. Her colleagues and supporters surrounded her, their respect and admiration evident. But perhaps the most significant moment came when Harris approached her privately. "Ms. Monroe," he began, his tone measured, "I want to commend you for the way you handled this case. Your preparation, your strategy, it was exemplary." Alexandria met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady. He hesitated, then added, "I also want to acknowledge something personal. I've been doing this for a long time, and I pride myself on being impartial. But this case, it's made me realize how much I still have to learn." For the first time, Alexandria allowed a small smile to break through. "Acknowledging it is the first step," she said, her tone kind but firm. The transformation was undeniable. Harris had started the trial as a figure of authority who unconsciously wielded his biases. Now, he was a man humbled, his perspective forever altered by the woman he had underestimated. Alexandria's power wasn't about dominance. It was about her ability to hold a mirror up to the system and demand accountability. She had not only won the case, but had also sparked a shift in the courtroom, a space that had long been a bastion of unchallenged authority. As she walked out of the courthouse, surrounded by her team, the ripple effects of her victory were already being felt. The case was being hailed as a turning point, a challenge to systemic inequities that could no longer be ignored. Harris watched her leave, a sense of catharsis settling over him. He knew the system wasn't fixed, far from it. But for the first time, he felt hopeful that change was possible, driven by people like Alexandria who refused to accept anything less than justice. The courthouse stood quiet now, its once bustling halls empty save for the lingering echoes of the trial. But the impact of what had transpired within its walls continued to ripple outward, touching lives and reshaping perspectives far beyond its confines. For Judge Harris, the trial became a turning point in both his career and his personal life. He spent days reflecting on what he had witnessed and the biases he had been forced to confront. Alexandria Monroe's unshakable composure, intellectual brilliance, and moral clarity had challenged everything he thought he knew about authority and justice. In the weeks following the trial, Harris began reevaluating his role within the judicial system. He sought out training on implicit bias, attended seminars on systemic inequities, and initiated conversations with colleagues about the hidden prejudices that shaped their decisions. One afternoon, he sat in his chambers, reviewing a new case. It involved a young man from a marginalized background, accused of a minor offense. In the past, Harris might have viewed the case through a lens of detached legality. Now, he took the time to understand the circumstances, to see the humanity behind the file. Harris realized that true justice required more than impartiality. It demanded active awareness and humility. While he could never undo the blind spots of his past, he resolved to carry the lessons forward, using his position to create a fairer courtroom for all. For Alexandria Monroe, the trial was a milestone but not an end. The victory bolstered her reputation as a formidable advocate for justice, and her phone didn't stop ringing for weeks. Requests poured in from community organizations, law firms, and even activists seeking her expertise. But Alexandria remained focused. She knew that systemic change was not achieved through a single case. The structures she fought against were deeply rooted, and dismantling them required sustained effort. In the months after the trial, she founded an initiative to mentor young Black women entering the legal field, providing them with resources and guidance to navigate a system that often undervalued their voices. One day, she returned to the same courthouse for another case, this time defending a young woman facing eviction. As she prepared to argue, she noticed Judge Harris presiding. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw in his expression not the quiet condescension of their first encounter, but a newfound respect. The trial was a hard-fought battle, but Alexandria emerged victorious once again. As she left the courtroom, a young law student approached her, inspired by her resolve. "You make me believe I can do this," the student said, her voice filled with hope. Alexandria smiled. "You can, and you will." The case of Davis versus Brookstone Corporation quickly became a landmark. It was cited in discussions about workplace discrimination, used in law school curricula, and debated in public forums. Alexandria's argument had exposed not just the biases of one company, but the larger patterns of inequity embedded within corporate and legal systems. Advocates across the country drew inspiration from the trial, pushing for reforms in hiring practices, workplace oversight, and judicial accountability. The case became a catalyst for change, reminding people that justice required vigilance and courage. Communities began to engage in difficult conversations about power, privilege, and systemic bias. Alexandria's victory showed that challenging entrenched systems was not only possible but necessary. The transformation didn't end with the courtroom. Alexandria's story became a rallying cry, urging individuals to examine their own perceptions of power and authority. Her journey demonstrated that power was not about titles or dominance. It was about integrity, courage, and the ability to see and value the humanity in others. Judge Harris often reflected on her words during the trial. Acknowledging it is the first step. He realized that true justice began with the willingness to admit one's own blind spots and work tirelessly to overcome them. For the audience observing the case, whether in the courtroom or through the media, the message was clear. Change starts when we challenge our assumptions and recognize the power of those who have long been underestimated. Years later, a new generation of lawyers and judges emerged, inspired by cases like Davis versus Brookstone Corporation. Among them were young women who had looked up to Alexandria Monroe as a trailblazer, carrying forward her legacy of resilience and justice. Judge Harris retired with a reputation as a man who had not only upheld the law but had grown within it, embracing the difficult journey of self-awareness and transformation. Alexandria, meanwhile, continued her fight, her influence spreading far beyond the courtroom. As the sun set on the courthouse one quiet evening, its facade gleamed with the promise of what justice could be, not perfect, but evolving. It stood as a testament to the power of recognizing and valuing the voices that had been ignored for far too long. In the end, the story wasn't just about one woman or one judge. It was about the potential for a system and a society to grow when it confronts its flaws and chooses to embrace change. And it left a question for all who witnessed it. What might the world look like if we all learned to see power not in dominance, but in courage, integrity, and truth?